This meeting to order, meeting number 14 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to the order of reference 1082, the committee is meeting on its study of the government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is taking place by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Should any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation or a problem with your audio, please advise me immediately and the technical team will work to resolve them. Please note that we may need to suspend during these times as we need to ensure all members are able to participate fully. Happy New Year to all of the committee members. Great to see you all looking well and healthy, and hopefully your families are well, and that we're going to have a successful 21, one way or another. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses now from the Canada West Foundation, Carlo Dade, Director, Trade and Investment Centre, and from the Toronto Region Board of Trade, we have Jan De Silva, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Leigh Smoot, President, World Trade Centre, Toronto, and from York University, Rhonda Lenton, President and Vice Chancellor. Welcome to you all. Very happy to have you with us today and appreciate your time. If we'd like to start with with Carlo Dade for Canada West Foundation. You need to unmute yourself, Mr. Dade.
Yes, the first words, the next generation, the 1 to 2 year olds will all know. Before mother and dad, mom and dad, they're going to learn the words. You're on mute. Donc, merci, madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure to be here again to discuss a topic of critical importance for Canada and the West in particular, international trade in the age of COVID.
The topic is important to the West in particular is not an understatement. We in the West are less than a third of Canada's population, yet we account for over 35% of the country's exports, a ratio not matched by any other region of the country. So the subject at hand has been a subject of a great deal of attention, thought, and research here at the Canada West Foundation. I'd like to share 2 items that emerged from this research that tie to your study. First, what will post-COVID trade look like? What should Canada do to prepare? And on what trade agreements should the country focus? I'll also add some comments about the trade relationship with our second largest trading partner, which is fundamentally important to the subject. Our written testimony, which you'll have a copy, also goes into in-depth on other subjects of your study, such as the Trade Commissioner Service and the larger issue of support to exporters. And our trade economist, has become a habit at Canada West, has provided a great deal of facts, figures, numbers, and charts to aid in your study. So with that, let's jump into the first question. How will trade change and what should we be doing? Trade, if you think about it, is essentially the movement of 4 factors of production: ideas, money, people, goods. The largest, or the factor in which we spend most time, is the movement of goods. And this is an area where Canada has serious problems. It is also an area that is not going to change post-COVID. And by not change, yes, you will have reshoring and other attributes, but the fundamental aspect of moving goods from point A to point B is not going to change. And this is an area where we have real problems in Canada. In 2019, the World Economic Forum's ranking of perception of quality of trade and reliability of trade infrastructure saw Canada drop 22 places from a high in 2008, 2009 during the Asia Pacific Gateway days to 32nd in the globe. Our customers have been telling us that we have a serious problem, yet you'd be hard pressed to see this reflected in actions that we've been taking. If we're going to export our way out of into COVID recovery, earn the money that we need to move on, we're going to have to address this issue. While our competitors like the UK and Australia have developed robust systems, institutions, and frameworks to collect data, turn it into information, and transparently use that data to make long-term project pipelines that link all the supply and production chains in the country, you see almost none of this in Canada. The one area where we have made investments, the National Trade Corridors Fund, was underfunded to begin with and has yet to be recapitalized. This isn't an encouraging sign for countries that are wondering if Canada can be a reliable source of exports and customers that can help us fund our way out of into COVID recovery. Yet there's hope. The government has set the stage by making competitiveness of trade corridors a national priority. The Council of Ministers of Transportation, co-chaired by Alberta's Rick McIver, are working on solutions. At CWF, we're leading a national coalition, including the Council of Canada, the Canadian Chamber, the Construction Association, Western Road Builders, Campotex, and others, to take 6 years of research to put forward concrete policy recommendations for government. So the stage is set on the trade infrastructure file, and I would urge attention to this. If you can't move goods, customers don't believe you can move goods, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the trade opening and the market opportunities that we have. That's fundamental. On the second question, which trade agreements should we focus? The answer is fairly straightforward. It's to focus on the agreements that we already have. First, this means focusing on the new North American agreement. We're going to have tons of issues dealing with the US administration. This was known throughout the negotiations, and we're going to have to focus time, effort, and resources on working with or fighting with the Americans on these issues. The second priority would be looking at expanding the CPTPP agreement. Look, we were very lucky to get one progressive trade agreement in Asia. Getting another agreement is going to be a bridge too far. So if progressive is really the focus, we should put our efforts onto trying to expand the one progressive agreement that exists. Additionally, going the bilateral route, doing things like looking at a trade agreement with Indonesia are suboptimal and potentially harmful for Canadian business. There's a reason businesses don't use trade agreements. Complex, too many rules. You've got one set of rules that work only for one market. You've got to change your production techniques to fit that market. And then you've got another set of rules and another set of requirements for yet another market. But an agreement like the TPP allows you to build supply and production chains across a large group of countries, cuts the cost, reduces the risk. Think of a small Canadian exporter that wants to export to Asia. Under the TPP, this company has one set of rules that it can use for 6 economies. It has the ability to sign one distribution agreement with one company in Singapore that can access all 6 markets. If you go the Indonesia route, they would have to sign an agreement for different production rules for each economy, distribution agreements for each country, and you've got a mess. So really, the multilateral route is the way to go. An exception will have to be made for the UK, obviously given the size of trade, but I would note that the UK is mostly services. We only trade one commodity. 73% of our exports to the UK are just one commodity, and that really doesn't benefit from a trade agreement, I would argue. Finally, a note on our second largest trading partner. Trade with China has been growing 12% a year. It's grown when we've had good relations with the country and when relations have been on the rocks. Again, overall growth. The issue is that day in, day out, Canadian businesses, Canadian consumers are making decisions that result in this trade increase. This results in facts on the ground that we have to manage. The government doesn't trade. Political parties don't trade. The private sector trades. And that trade is creating issues that have to be managed whether we want to deal with them or not. Not engaging China to manage this trade does nothing to help Canada, does nothing to advance our interests, and will not get our hostages back sooner. So we really have to face this. If you're thinking about countries that are growing post-COVID, that are already on the rebound, you're talking about China. So this will become more of an issue. And again, if you look at our competitors, Australia and New Zealand are confronting China on political issues, yet they've just signed a new agreement with China. The EU is also confronting and fighting China on issues on a daily basis, yet it has just signed a trade agreement. And the US, which is almost in a hot war with China, just stabbed us in the back, shivved us in the back when it signed its phase one trade agreement with China. You may remember that during the NAFTA negotiations, the Americans told us not to even dare think about negotiating with China. But what were they doing? They were negotiating an agreement that basically threw Canadian farmers under the bus. So we're really going to have to think about balancing our interests, the political, the economic with China, and the political and the economic with the United States. But this is not a new problem. The Diefenbaker government managed to protect Canadian interests by breaking a US embargo on grain sales to China, while at the same time standing shoulder to shoulder with the US and fighting the Cold War. This is something our allies continue to do, but which we've forgotten to do. So with that, I'll end. Actually, for the first time ever in front of the committee, I'm going to end early. I would note that I'm happy to talk about TCS, happy to talk about KXL, or happy to talk about Buy America or any of the other issues that are current. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dade. On to Jan De Silva, President and Chief Executive Officer, Toronto Board of Trade. Welcome. Nice to see you back at committee again.
Nice to see you. Thanks so much. Bonjour et merci, Madame.
Hello and thank you.
And thank you to the committee for inviting us to speak to Canada's international trade during and after COVID. As mentioned, I'm President and CEO of the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Joining me today is my colleague Lee Smout, President of the World Trade Center Toronto, the board's trade services arm. Our focus in our discussion with you today is on the work that we're doing to actually activate Canadian businesses to take advantage of the trade opportunities that have been created. The Toronto Region Board of Trade represents more than 13,500 businesses in the Toronto region. 75% are small and medium-sized enterprises. First, on behalf of our members, I want to thank you for your strong and responsive efforts during these incredibly challenging times. Your actions have kept hundreds of thousands of businesses afloat across the country. At the board, we focus on solutions to help businesses thrive and grow. Pre-COVID, our World Trade Center had a 5-year track record of proven programs that have helped more than 1,200 Canadian SMEs go global. And since the pandemic, we've pivoted existing programs and launched a new program to help businesses adapt to the conditions of COVID. I'm going to turn the mic over to Lee to share some more.
Thank you, Jan. As the board's trade services arm, our focus is on programs and supports that help businesses scale up and access growth markets. And while we develop and launch these programs in Toronto, we also work with partner chambers and World Trade Centers and economic development agencies and so on across Canada to make sure that these are all delivered, these programs are delivered nationally. We've created the award-winning Trade Accelerator program, which has helped over 1,200 Canadian businesses become trade ready with proprietary export plans. And through more than 21 World Trade Center run business missions, we've connected hundreds of these companies to targeted customers in international markets, delivering tremendous commercial results. When the pandemic struck, shuttering storefronts, halting international travel, and disrupting supply chains, we, like others, moved our programs online, including taking our trade missions virtual. Since then, just since that time, more than 200 businesses have participated in our virtual Trade Accelerator programs across Canada again, and more than 120 have joined virtual missions. Moving our programs online also helped us to see that many of the SMEs we were trying to help are really truly lagging behind in their digital capabilities. This led us to create the Recovery Activation Program to help businesses understand where and how to go digital. To date, more than 900 Ontario businesses have joined this program to learn how to digitize their front, middle, and back offices. Let me share just a few examples of our program's impact. Sinorama from Peterborough applaud the Recovery Activation Program for providing the practical tools and mentorship needed to address the COVID challenges to their operations. Signify Solutions from Mississauga credit our Trade Accelerator program for developing their export plan and activating international contact in growth markets for their cloud-enabled vending systems. And finally, Greenlid from Toronto, who joined 26 other companies for a clean tech mission to Mexico and credited the program for the opportunity to meet with qualified buyers to develop the market for their compostable kitchen green bins. Back to you, Jen.
As a country, our businesses are in the position to benefit from the federal government's commitment to diversifying trade. I certainly agree with the comments of Mr. Dade just preceding me about the need for engagement with target markets and really solidifying our movement of goods capacity within the country. But I did want to echo the fact that your efforts have given us access to 1.5 billion potential customers through 14 free trade agreements covering 51 countries. The imperative now is to get Canadian businesses to take action on those. At a time when access to local in-person customers is hampered by the pandemic, digital access to global customers is not. Exporting will not be a panacea to the economic challenges our businesses have withstood, but it's certainly a mighty tool. And we encourage the federal government to double down on trade, on equipping our businesses to export, and to equip them to be digitally ready. For digital readiness is the new price of admission for business survival and trade during the pandemic and beyond. Companies need support to get through this challenging time, not only in the form of cash infusions, which are providing temporary relief, but also national access to the Recovery Activation and Trade Accelerator programs outlined by Lee. These programs are making our businesses resilient for COVID and positioning them to access growth markets, which will also position them to scale up in recovery. In closing, thank you again for your investments and partnerships with us. Together, we're the helping hand many businesses need in this difficult period. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And I want to welcome Rhonda Lenton from York University. Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Madam Chair, distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to speak with you about the university sector in the context of international trade. You know, I could speak with you about what universities are doing in terms of the research, including the movement of goods, what we're doing in terms of supporting innovation, startups, and scale up. But I wanted to come to talk to you today about the importance of increasing support for international education as a means of strengthening Canada's economy in a post-pandemic context. International education has grown significantly in the last 10 years, and it has the potential to be one of the top Canadian exports if this level of growth continues. Currently, international students contribute more than $21 billion to the Canadian economy every year. To begin, I feel I should note that while I'm here as a representative of York University, I think it's fair to say that the challenges and opportunities that I will speak about are relevant for the broader Canadian university sector. As a point of reference, York University is consistently in the top 3 to 5 Canadian institutions for international education, and it's home to more than 8,500 of Canada's 200,000 plus international undergraduate and graduate students. International education supports multiple goals and gaps in Canada's foreign policy, including helping to fulfill the need for skilled immigration, counteracting the effects of an aging society on our economy, and advancing diplomacy. In addition, international students are a crucial part of Canada's research, innovation, and entrepreneurship ecosystem. International graduate students in particular contribute to the backbone of our research enterprise. And of course, international graduates and researchers who decide to return to their home countries provide important business and research networks for the future and become lifelong ambassadors for Canada and Canadian values. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadian universities have experienced significant declines in international student enrollment. After 5 years of experiencing, on average, 10% growth in international student enrollment, international enrollment was down 2% across Canada this year. 51 Canadian universities experienced a decline in international students compared to last year. Of these, 26 saw a decline of more than 10%, and 14 saw a decline of more than 20%. We recognize and appreciate the many ways that the federal government has supported international education since the beginning of the pandemic, including policy changes that allowed online study for international students, border exemptions that enabled students to come to Canada, comprehensive support packages, and significant investments in research funding. We also appreciate the federal government's recognition of international education as an essential pillar of Canada's long-term competitiveness and its commitment to supporting international education through the release of the 2019 International Education Strategy and its corresponding efforts to diversify the education sector, boost Canada's innovation capacity, promote global ties, and foster a vibrant Canadian economy. Despite these efforts, however, York and other Canadian universities continue to face significant recruitment and retention challenges. I would just like to highlight 4 areas for attention. Permit processing times. Wait times have averaged as long as 35 to 44 weeks for key international markets, and visa processing continues to be the least competitive aspect of Canada's international education brand. There's a need for a more sophisticated, data-driven market intelligence and a comprehensive marketing strategy to position Canada as a preferred destination for international students. Our marketing is currently being conducted piecemeal on the institutional, provincial, and national levels, but we need a coordinated national approach to maximize impact and reach. We also have an over-reliance on key markets. We currently rely heavily on the core international markets for the majority of our international recruitment. We must diversify our market development approach to ensure that Canada has a stronger presence in regions that are likely to become more competitive in the coming years, such as the ASEAN countries, Colombia, Senegal, Morocco. And finally, the disjointed and heavily bureaucratic system of governance for international education is an issue. Many different bodies manage the various elements of the international education process, including 3 federal ministries, 13 provincial and territorial ministries, and several institutions, among others. Our educational strategies and activities are not aligned, resulting in students receiving mixed messages. I have a request. In order to overcome these challenges and continue to attract and support international students, Canadian universities urgently need an agile, streamlined, and coordinated approach to educational oversight in Canada. We would urge the federal government to create a national agency that acts as a sector-specific trade organization to align the mandates of the various federal ministries and agencies involved in international education, to coordinate Canada's international education approach, ensure that visa processing is handled in an expeditious manner, create talent luring programs to enhance Canada's competitive edge and make it a more attractive destination for international students, collect and distribute data-driven market intelligence and promote Canada as a leading destination for higher education. This is a particularly urgent need as we currently have a short window of opportunity before the new political administration in the US amends its immigration policies to make America a more attractive destination for international students and develop relationships with priority markets. In particular, we would recommend the completion of a trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. One excellent model for the type of national body that I have described is the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, the international trade promotion and investment attraction agency responsible for aligning Australia's import, export, investment, tourism, and education strategies. Its mandate includes generating market information and insights, promoting Australian capability, and facilitating connections to its extensive global network. The goals of international education strategy and trade are interconnected. Both focus on attracting new talent to the country, boosting our innovation capacity, promoting global ties, and fostering a vibrant Canadian economy. Increasing federal support for international education will help make Canada a more attractive destination for international students and provide Canadian universities with the foundation that they need to remain competitive in the global economy throughout the pandemic recovery period and beyond. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lenton. We're pleased to have you with us. We'll go on to committee members. Mr. Hoback for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and it's great to see everybody here in January, in the new year of 2021. I want to start off with Mr. Dade. Mr. Dade, last year, in talking to a lot of different people around the world, there were starting to be alliances formed from country to country in regards to trade, to making sure that they've got supplies, whether it's PPEs or core elements to go into some of their manufacturing. And there was a rejigging and a talk of rejigging about getting rid of the reliance on one country for being a sole supplier in certain componentry and things like that. How do you see that happening now? Do you see that as a structural change, or is that just talk and a fad?
No, you're absolutely right in the analysis as to what's happening. We saw similar movements with past pandemics. So there is, for instance, something we don't discuss, a North American pandemic agreement. Yet the measures we've taken in the past in terms of such agreements, really in light of the performance in the current pandemic, don't appear to have been too effective. So the question is, have we finally learned the lesson? Are we taking this serious? Are we going to go back to the first round of agreements we did and try and make them work? On that note, I would caution with the committee that our relations with the U.S. and the North American ideas for a North American supply and production chain for critical pandemic response materials is, in the first instance, obvious and necessary, but in the second requires caution. Donald Trump wasn't the first president to threaten pandemic supplies to Canada. You go back to Gerald Ford, and you may remember that with swine flu, Gerald Ford threatened the same thing. So as we look to these agreements, we need to make sure that we cover our back, have plan Bs. Countries like Taiwan, or economies like Taiwan and Korea are good sources.
Yeah, good point. And I guess in those conversations, and this goes on to our university students, what I'm hearing is a lot of countries are re-looking at their university and the foreign student programs and saying, why am I training all these foreign students, giving away my research and development dollars, my tax dollars, and then letting them go home? Why aren't we attracting these students, and not only attracting them, trying to keep them here in Canada so that they develop that research and use that research and take it to commercialization here in Canada instead of it going back to somewhere in Asia or somewhere else around the world? Do you think we need to rethink our university policies, Ms. Lanton, in regards to that, and maybe tie it closer to our immigration policies and making sure that we don't go about training our competitors?
I would suggest nuance rather than do a wholesale reevaluation. When students go back,
Mrs. Layton, Mr. Dade.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I was interested in hearing what answer you might have. But thank you so much, Madam Chair. Let me comment on the member's question. I think it's incredibly important to always remember what the significant source for immigration our international students are. And it's been very popular. Our 3-year work permit after graduation has been an incredibly attractive feature of our higher education policy. A great number of those students stay. And these are students who have stronger English skills, who have relevant university credentials, and often have work placement experience by the time they graduate. So it's a tremendous source. But even those students who go back home, these students act as our ambassadors, and they help us establish networks of innovation, networks of research across the world. And I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's just exactly how small the world is and how important it is for us to build and establish those kinds of international collaborations that we are working together on these major global issues.
Fair enough. And I think that requires some study for sure and some re-looking at, but I think we need to find a new way of doing this and taking advantage of those types of things. I'm going to go to Toronto Board of Trade.
I think, Mr. Hoback, I'm
out of
sorry,
time
your
already.
6 minutes is up. I
Carlo.
was stretching it out for you to give you your maximum minutes there.
Thank you.
On to Mr. Sarai.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the speakers. It's always insightful to get insight on the ground and find out what's going on. My questions to Ms. Lenton from York. Students are not only important to the universities they attend, but they're also an important part of their community's economy. You've already mentioned on specifically on international students affecting the economy, but small and medium-sized businesses rely on students for their businesses or as employees, especially for smaller communities. They have most likely seen a dramatic impact in this area. What has been your university's experience and challenges with COVID-19? And how do you see the way you operate changing post-pandemic? And what might be some of the implications going forward for local economies as a result of possibly not having as many students attending university in person, at least for the next little while?
You know, I do want to say that it's been incredibly important that we have transitioned all of our programming to predominantly to online, so that we are able to actually ensure that our students were able to continue in their programs. The decisions that students made to attend university actually was hugely aided by the federal program to provide financial support for students. And so for a university like York, for example, where 2/3 of our students work part-time to put themselves through school, the fact that that program was rolled out actually for us ended up increasing the number of students that we have. We're 4% over our contract targets. And that's incredibly important because not only do our local businesses rely on the future talent that we are bringing forward, and in fact, we're developing programming very much in step with emerging needs. We're also developing new programming that's dealing with the fact that AI and automation are impacting about 50% of all jobs. And so we've really got to be providing the future talent that is needed. It'll be incredibly challenging if it was the case that we saw a significant decline. And so it comes back again to the international student, because domestically, actually, I think we've done quite well with what has been done by the federal government. And it's finding ways to make sure that we continue to still attract that international student base. In some areas especially, they are an incredibly important source of students and future employees.
Further to that, we have a lot of international students here in Surrey, and many go to Simon Fraser or other colleges, Kwantlen Polytech, and other postgraduate programs out here. But my concern is a lot of them seem to be getting into programs that perhaps are not really what they want to be doing or what they will be doing. And I like your idea of getting some sort of an agency to put them or guide them so that they do career choices or study in a place that will be needed in Canada and they'll get actually jobs in their sector. What's the quickest way to do that other than a very large overbody? What would be the best way to get these students to apply and be in programs that are actually needed for the workplace here? And how can universities, play that role?
You know, I want to say that we are already playing that role. And to some extent, we're playing that role because students themselves want additional information about what are the emerging career paths. They're very market savvy in terms of wanting to ensure that, yes, let me get an education, let me get those transferable skills, but how is this going to connect? And a very important piece of that has been the rollout and expansion of experiential education and work integrated learning. This is one of the best ways to directly align the kinds of programs that students are choosing and how those actually relate to their career interests. And supports both provincially and federally for work integrated learning programs have been incredibly important in terms of our ability to actually expand them.
Thank you. This is to the Board of Trade, the Toronto Board of Trade. You have seen a lot of changes in the last 10 months and that have accelerated change in how businesses do and conduct business. Some have come to the forefront. For example, home deliveries and from grocers to online shopping has accelerated plans that were in place for 5 years down to months where they've had to cope. How has the board and its members been responding to this accelerated change resulting from the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I'm going to let Lee take that because Lee runs our recovery activation program, which was developed in May for specifically the conditions that you're discussing. Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the member's question, we've had a very interesting experience working with businesses in Toronto at every level, every size. And so small and medium-sized businesses have struggled in all the ways you can imagine. You mentioned street side shopping and so on. And to that end, there's been a lot of programs put in place to help them build their e-commerce software and put up websites where they could sell. The challenge is not just for those Main Street organizations, not just sort of the local professional services in the store that you can walk to. It's also for small manufacturers, some of the companies that are maybe not so visible. They're not sitting there on the main street, but they're off in a neighborhood, an industrial neighborhood, and so on. They needed help with. They were losing supply chains, as Mr. Dade had mentioned earlier. Supply chains are disrupted. They suddenly had a workforce that some of which they have to have in shop to manage their process, but others were able to work from home in their sales teams and so on. They needed new sales programs because they're used to going to a trade show and suddenly they can't go to a trade show to sell anymore. So any future sales program that's going to take them through a longer recovery was really disrupted. So we've been able to
Thank you very much, Mr. I try and keep everybody online here as much as I can. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
Salutations, merci Madame la.
Hello, thank you. I would like to thank all the witnesses for their presentations. I'm pleased to be here for this first meeting of this year. I would like to ask for specifics from Miss Lenton. The interpreter would like to note that the sound quality is very poor. We need to raise awareness for universities. I would like to know what you meant by having an agency that could supervise education. The interpreter regrets again, but the comments and the questions were not very clear.
So please do let me know if the sound is a bit better now. What I want to say is that in some countries, and I gave Australia as the example, that having one agency that actually coordinates the national approach to education. Right now in Canada, we have 3 different federal ministries that in one way or another deal with higher education. And it means that sometimes students can get different messages about, what's attractive to coming into the country, but then the visa application is taking many, many weeks. And so when you've got one agency, a national agency, there's a greater opportunity for alignment for the same message, but also for thinking about how the education strategy aligns with strategies such as tourism, goods and services and so forth. So it's that concept of having one federal agency that would far better allow for coordination, not only at a federal level, but better coordination with all of the provincial ministries as well.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, could you unplug and plug again your microphone, please?
Maintenant, qu'est-ce que ça donne?
Now, how is it?
Allez-y, on va voir.
Oui. Là, alors, je continue.
So, I'll just be talking, or do you want me to do a test?
Continuez tout simplement.
Please continue. Therefore, I understand with the idea to have a federal trade agency, but concretely, what would that mean? I understand that there are different difficulties and education has a role to play, but wouldn't that could be maybe a little bit dangerous in terms of commercializing education if a trade agency was supervising the education system?
Well, I think it's very important when we look at how this has been working in a country such as Australia. And it's true, it is the International Trade Promotion and Investment Attraction Agency. But the goal of the agency is to align Australia's import, export, investment, tourism, and education strategies. And so I think that this is part of the challenge of what we're facing in Canada is the alignment of those strategies. But even to have just one agency that would focus on bringing together all of the aspects about higher education that are now in 3 different federal ministries. Just even that, if we were to have a more focused national strategy on higher education within, one area, rather than having to sort of coordinate different aspects of higher education in these 3 different ministries, even that would be a significant improvement. And it would really position Canada more competitively compared to these other countries.
And Madam Chair, if there's time permitting, I wouldn't mind responding as well. I've got some experience. Prior to moving back to Toronto, I was running Ivy Business School's Asia campus out of Hong Kong. And I can just echo what Rhonda is saying. Our biggest competition for Canada was not the US. The US was on a different level in terms of how Asian students were looking at university opportunities. Our competition was the UK and Australia. And the focus that Rhonda's outlined very much was the Australia model, very much the UK model about how do you brand Canadian universities as a destination for talent development, and how do you make sure that you've got the visa processes simplified and aligned, and how do you think about opportunities for extended work visas or paths to citizenship. So I would encourage us using the UK and Australia as our competition, and those are really organized or jurisdictions that offer much better harmonization of effort, of branding, and of support for students coming in.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Silva. On to Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much. I guess one of the questions that I'd like to probe, because I feel like it's not just been a theme that's come up today, but it's a theme that's come up generally in my time on the Trade Committee here, is that it sounds to me like we're hearing often from different organizations that Canada has gotten out ahead in terms of its market access on paper, of its ability to actually exploit the opportunities that are in trade agreements, and that we stand out among our Western competitors anyway in terms of our government having a real strategy for how what we want to produce and how we want that to benefit Canadians. I know that's a very general topic, but I think Mr. Dade touched on it a little bit in his own remarks, and I've heard it kind of peppered in elsewhere. So I wonder if folks just want to speak very directly to this question of, we know Canada is now party to many agreements. Some of you will know the NDP has had its critique of those agreements over the years, to put it mildly. But it does seem that Canada is way out ahead in terms of market access on paper than what we're able to exploit in the best sense of that word. So I wonder if any of our witnesses would like to speak to that theme. Maybe we'll start with Mr. Dade, because I know it was in his opening remarks, and then Ms. De Silva after that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank the member from Elmwood Transcona for that question. I would actually counter that. Canada, on paper, we do have a long list of agreements, but our ability to actually have agreements that work with business, that reduce the cost for businesses, the ability of businesses to get there, is not as good as our competitors. And I would point to the work that we did at Canada West that's in the briefing material you have on the problems we have with our export support services for business. The issue there, like trade agreements, is we have so many, but they're separate, they're disparate, it's confusing for businesses, especially businesses that are trading in the US and haven't traditionally used trade services, to figure out what from this long list of services, who does what, EDC, BDC, TCS. So we have some real fundamental problems in terms of rationalization and organization here in Canada. The paper I just referenced looks at the American experience in bringing rationality and coherence to their disparate trade services to enhance the ability of American firms to go abroad. We lack a strategy, especially for Asia and for booming markets in Asia. We do not have a white paper on trade strategy. We do not have a white paper for Asia, for China. One of my colleagues on the panel was mentioning Australia. One of the reasons Australia, I think, has had better performance is that they've managed to have government policy and have clear objectives set through white papers. There are problems with that, but I think that's a real problem. On the overall strategy level, it's been a major issue. And I do not think that Canada is performing as well as it can. Our absence from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is another indication of a problem. Our problems getting into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, was an indication of another problem that did real damage to Canadian trade aspirations in Asia.
Thank you. Ms. De Silva?
My focus would be simply that I think we've got incredible market access. As I alluded to before, I spent 15 years living in Asia, running Canadian businesses there and then Ivy Business School. And when I was coming back into this role, the Board of Trade was actually doing a study on our SMEs and trade. And I can tell you from living in Asia, the challenge is not market access. The challenge is our companies need more support in terms of activating trade. I think Australia is an excellent example. They didn't have the US next door. Their next door is Asia, and that's why they've had no choice but to focus. Some of the smaller European countries are far more active in trade than we are because they just simply didn't have big enough markets and they had to go global, and they've done it with a concerted strategy. So the work we've done through Lee's organization, the Trade Accelerator Program, was an effort that's proving very successful to bring EDC, BDC, trade commissioner services, the private sector to the table to help small and medium-sized enterprises get practical tools for exporting. While I fully acknowledge there's more we can be doing within Canada to help companies scale and grow, for instance, the dreaded interprovincial trade barriers, which mean our small companies have to go global to scale instead of scaling in Canada. The reality is the work that the World Trade Center is doing is proving to be effective, and it's really helping businesses understand what it's going to take to trade and then connecting them to the right growth markets for them rather than simply pivoting south and thinking the US is where they should grow. Lee, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add to that.
Well, I would add that while we have all of these wonderful trade agreements in place, our ability for the ability for companies to understand them is challenging. So to Mr. Dave Jan's points, we bring together groups, the groups that understand this so that companies can get to it. But I would also say that there's opportunities like things like our agreement with the EU, CITA. Everybody understands that we've dropped tariffs on 98 or 99 maybe now % of goods. What they don't necessarily understand is the opportunity to bid on infrastructure projects of every level across all of those government contracts, which are all in one place on one website. So I think there's a lot of education, a lot of training that's still needed in order to get SMEs up to the level of some of our larger companies in terms of trade.
Thank you. Thank you very much. On to Ms. Gray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. I have a couple of questions for the Canada West Foundation. And in your testimony, you had mentioned that with the current government in talks right now to create a trade agreement with Indonesia, and I think the word that you used was that was suboptimal. And I'm wondering if you can maybe go into some details as to why you had those thoughts and what the rationale for that is.
Sure. Very briefly, a one-on-one bilateral agreement sets up a set of rules that include things like rules of origin and phytosanitary and other arrangements that work only for that market. So as a business, if you have a supply and production chain that, say, goes into other countries, Japan or Singapore or Australia, and you want to use goods and services from a wider array of economies, using that makes you more competitive as a business. You run into problems having to retool things to work just with Indonesia. It creates yet another set of rules, yet another set of bureaucracy and paperwork. The strategy that we're seeing other countries pursue is to move to regional agreements where that cost of compliance is then spread out amongst several economies. So we have a progressive trade agreement, which I know is important to the country and this government, to many members of committee, I think all members of committee. And the ability to do that on an individual bilateral basis, I think, will also be more challenging. So for all of these reasons, we have a very good high-level agreement. Agreement's attractive to countries because it has Japan, Canada, other markets. So my point is that when you have the option to increase a large-scale multilateral progressive agreement, that's where you should be putting your resources. A bilateral agreement may give tariff benefits to one or two major companies, but for smaller businesses, SMEs that we want to grow, I would argue that expanding the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is the way to go. And I forgot to note that the UK Parliament is now holding hearings about their joining the TPP. So that's the type of agreement we want to focus on.
Great, thank you. And that sort of leads into the next question that I had, because also in your earlier testimony, you had mentioned focusing on trade agreements that we currently have. And I wanted to ask you about non-tariff barriers and how that fits in, because we hear that from a lot of different industries, how that is one of the barriers that they're seeing. And those could be a whole number of different things depending on what the sector is. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that, if that all ties together in your comments.
Sure. Modern trade agreements have moved from reducing tariffs, which are already generally fairly low. The World Trade Organization rounds have done great work there, to focusing on those issues. So I think the new trade agreements we see are working very diligently to address these issues. And we just put out 90 pages on the Canada-China relationship focused on non-tariff barrier issues in agriculture. So we and others are doing a lot of thinking about how to resolve those issues. I would note, though, that a non-tariff barrier can be in the eye of the beholder. What is protecting health and safety or social concerns on one side can often be viewed as protectionist on the other. And it's a thorny issue, and it's persisted in being the problem for that very reason. But there is progress being made. There is international best practice, and fortunately, work on that is being done in Canada.
Great, thank you. And on that same topic, if you were to break it down to, maybe one or two or three very specific as the top issues or the top ways that existing trade agreements could be focused on, what would those be, sort of broken down into a very concise list?
Sure.
A brief answer, Mr. Dade.
I'll give you one. The procedures taken with the Americans in the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, stricter requirements, yes or no, no fudging in terms of compliance to non-tariff barrier issues. We've done an exhaustive look at the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement. I would recommend skimming the part of the paper on that to get some insights there.
Thank you, Mr. Dade. On to Mr. Sheehan.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this very, very important information that we're receiving today. And there's lots for us to think about, and it's very good testimony. I think I'm going to start with President Lenton, and I really liked your approach on what you were saying about the international students. I think that Canada, well, in 2019 we moved and leapfrogged both England and China into third as the top destination for international students, with America and Australia in 1 or 2. And it's quite amazing. And half of the 642,000 students choose Ontario. So recognize the work that York does. In Sault Ste. Marie, we have Algoma University and Sault College as a, that have quite a few international students. And, I've been working with them and I'm also working with other universities and colleges across Northern Ontario as they adapt, because within the context of what's happening, we have, provincial stay-at-home orders, et cetera, and, we're very hopeful as September that we'll be able to, get back to, more students being here. But until such time, with the health plans that the provinces require from international students, we have to ensure everyone's safe. So my question is, how are you using IT to reach those students, to keep them engaged, to making sure that we still remain in the top 3 destinations that we've recently enjoyed in 2019?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'll answer the member in this way. I want to say first of all that each student's circumstances are quite unique. And we have, and within each country, there are different kinds of issues that students face within each country, even some going down to access to high-speed internet. And so the universities very quickly pivoted to, we knew that we were going to make sure that, have to ensure that our students were going to be able to continue their programs. By far the majority, only a very small number of courses actually have an in-person component right now in the arts and certain labs. But we have faced a number of issues. In fact, at York, we even did an entire laptop rollout program where we purchased thousands of laptops and we made those laptops available to students that didn't have access to the technology. There's also been various issues in different countries around content, and we have to negotiate all of that. But what was imperative was ensuring that we were going to make sure that students could continue in their programs. We were going to pivot to a digital reality. And even when in-person comes back, we will still be maintaining huge components of that digital reality. And we're also doing a great deal in the experiential education digital reality. We had all of our students in Lassonde Engineering and in the Schulich School of Business, for example, partner with the City of Toronto on a Shop Here program, where they work side by side with small and medium-sized businesses to help them convert their whole goods and services into a digital reality. So these are just a couple of the examples of what we have been doing to ensure that we can continue high quality delivery, make that commitment to the developing the talent that we'll need for the future, and negotiating the different issues that our students have depending on the countries that they're in, how lectures have to be offered to ensure that students have that in-person experience, even if it's a virtual in-person experience.
Thank you. My next question is to the Board of Trade. Recently, we announced through the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund $50 million for Digital Main Street that I know that you were a part of it, along with some other folks in the Toronto area as well as across Ontario. And how is that working for your clients? And is there any kind of cross-pollination opportunities with the new virtual trade missions to try and get our SMEs more involved into trade? So I guess Mr. Smoot, I'll start with first, and just Silva too.
Thank you very much, member. We are very integrated with the Digital Main Street program. As you mentioned, it was funded across the province. Ours is a smaller portion of it from a funding point of view, but it's probably as critically important. And as I was speaking about earlier, it's not just about the retail and Main Street. It's actually focusing on a lot of manufacturing and so on. And what we found from a lot of those companies is we start with a digital needs assessment. We have more than 900 companies through. The results have been that 70% of them are either in the explorer or novice level of looking at digitizing their business, very, very much in need of help. And only about 10% really would be considered leaders. And that's against international benchmarks that we've worked up with partners and with foresters. And so we have been very focused on practical programming, bringing those organizations in and doing intensive training, working with experts in the private sector, so companies can work with, for instance, a lawyer about regulation who's from BLG as opposed to the local lawyer they might have been able to use. So there's a lot of support we're providing there.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. A very quick question. Is my sound okay? because I want to facilitate the work for our interpreters. I have a question for Mr. Dade. You spoke of multiple trade agreements. We know that during negotiations, often parliamentarians, provinces, and stakeholders don't have their say and have to make do with existing agreements. But what about the rediscovery of local buying since the beginning of this pandemic and the necessity of offering help to our businesses, our local businesses? Quebec fought to keep certain contracts in Canada in the midst of CIIT, and so even for vehicles to be assembled in Quebec, for example. And so do you think that there could be redundancies in agreements for rules of origin, for example? If one country has signed different agreements with different countries, it's difficult to combine those different percentages. So what would you say about that?
Ouais, désolé. Donc, merci pour la question.
Thank you for your question. I will answer in English.
That rationalization of different rules amongst agreements is done through the legal scrubs and through processes at Foreign Affairs and the Trade Mission. It's also the work of export promotion agencies and export support agencies to help work with businesses on rationalizing those and coming up with the best advantage. I look on it as a glass half full. There are opportunities to search for the best solution, the best set of rules that fit businesses and gives more opportunities to businesses. I would quickly caution on the local buying requirements and rules. We are fighting with the Americans, or preparing to fight with the Americans over Buy America. By international comparisons, Canada has a bad, I wouldn't say a bad reputation, but the data indicates that we are not one of the best performers in making government procurement available. We fall under the OECD average for percent of government procurement made available under the World Trade Organization General Government Procurement Agreement. It took Canadian provinces 20 years, 2 decades, to sign on to the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. None of this stands us in good stead internationally. I would point to Saskatchewan, though, as an example of a province I think is going about this right. Priority Sask is working with businesses in Saskatchewan to give them business assistance, training, strengthening their ability to bid for contracts so that businesses in Saskatchewan can bid for local contracts and can compete against firms from larger jurisdictions that are better resourced. So the way to go about this is not through government regulation, but through capacity building and strengthening of businesses to allow them to compete not only at home, but to compete abroad.
Thank you, Mr. Dade. On to Mr. Blakey for 2 minutes.
Sure. I think just pursuing the kind of earlier question, it seems to me that, I mean, Canada stands out as being a country that does significantly less industrial planning domestically than a lot of our competitors. We talk a lot about international trade, and I would say sometimes even have a dogmatic emphasis on free trade agreements. Yet we hear that, you know, Canadian business is often unready to exploit the advantages of the touted advantages of the agreements we sign. To what extent is that a product of not really having an industrial strategy as a country? I mean, we also take a kind of laissez-faire approach to our domestic economy as an article of faith as well, but it seems to me not to work very well when we talk about what we want to accomplish on the international stage and how we want to support companies to succeed on the international stage and how we want to translate that into value-added jobs in Canada, because we've also seen over the last 25, 30 years a loss of a lot of value-added production too. So we're out signing international trade agreements. There's been GDP growth, to be sure, and a lot of Canadian businesses have thrived, but we've lost a lot of value-added work. We don't have industrial strategies domestically. We're signing agreements that open up our markets as much as they provide us market access, and yet we don't seem ready to seize those opportunities. So does anybody care to speak to the relationship between industrial planning at home and having a cohesive international trade agenda?
I'm happy to provide a few points of context. As Lee mentioned in his remarks, we work with major cities across Canada for our programming. We also, closer to home, work with the 34 municipalities that are the Toronto-Waterloo corridor. We view this as a large economic zone. And if you think of how economic zones in other parts of the world, look to Australia, look to markets in Asia, there's much more attention on what are the conditions for success for those economic zones. So things like movement of goods strategy, looking at employment land use, looking at the deployment of technology, all of those things require attention to support our local economy, but also to support the development of companies, for example, in supply chains that have the potential to not only service locally, but also have the capacity to go global. And something I would point to right now as a very live emerging case study is Ford and GM signaling that Southern Ontario is going to become, or has the potential to become, a global EV, electric vehicle center. $1.8 billion of funding by Ford, matched by $600 million of government funding. And the impact is not just those workers in the Ford factory in Oakville, it's all the supply chain in Southern Ontario, it's all the talent coming out of our universities that are going to need to be equipped to work in that environment. So what I would simply say is it's not one or the other. I think things need to be happening in parallel. And I would say the markets that are more economically competitive than ours have found a way to get their arms around thinking of our economy not as a city or a place, but thinking of it as an integrated set of activities in a geography that needs to have competitiveness considerations to eliminate pain points. So
Thank you
I mean,
very
I
much.
would certainly
I'm sorry,
agree.
Mr. Blakey, we've run out of time. Mr. Abutai.
Well, thank you, Chair. I know I have a short time, but the question to Mr. Date is Keystone pipeline was canceled. Line 5 is facing a shutdown by May. How do you read this? For the short time I have here, probably I have a couple of minutes. How do you read this as overall when it comes to the oil and gas industry and the future, of course, of trade, because big chunk of our trade with the U.S. is the oil and gas. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Before I dive in, for Mr. Blakey, happy to talk with you offline about it. The issue you raised is a major subject amongst us pinheads. So happy to talk to you in depth offline about that. For Keystone, a couple points. One, the direction on Keystone was clear. We knew 7 months ago what was going to happen, yet we chose not to listen and we chose not to pay attention. We sought out voices that told us what we wanted to hear, not what we needed to hear. So the first thing for the wider committee is in thinking about how much the US has changed from Obama through Trump. Our framework for analysis, the analysts who are working on this, I don't think have evolved with the US. Racial reconciliation is a central issue, even in economics and trade, with the new Interior Secretary in the States. Yet, from all the analysts you have coming in to talk to you, how many are prepared to talk about the new reality in the States? On Keystone, the Biden administration has signaled that the U.S. is serious about the transition away from fossil fuels. It's not quitting cold turkey, it's a gradual transition. With Keystone, they've cut the rate of growth of imports of Canadian oil. They've done the same thing to themselves by cutting new leases on federal lands. It's to begin an orderly transition. They're very clear about this. We have to realize that if this is the direction the US is going, and we do not have votes in Congress to change them, we are going to have to adapt to the new opportunities that they're putting on EVs, other clean tech, carbon capture. We have to respond to the new opportunities. At the same time, we have to make sure that this transition does not first hit the Canadian oil patch. So as the US slowly looks to cut, we have to make sure that the current movement of oil and goods to the U.S. remains the same. I do not believe that Americans are ready to quit oil cold turkey. They are ready to start transitioning, and we have to be prepared and adapt to that. This could mean decades of continued oil from the oil sands, but the days of rapid growth, booms and busts, I think, are over, and we have to adapt to this reality. GM announced today or yesterday that they're no longer going to be making gas vehicles. The reality is there. We have opportunities to profit from the shift in the U.S. We have to pivot and begin to look at that while we maintain our current production to the U.S. as they move away.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hodai. Ms. Bedallion, I understand you have 1 minute. Ms. Bedallion? Yeah.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my mute button. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll ask just one quick question then before we wrap up this session. I would address it to Mr. Leigh-Smoot, who I believe was at the Toronto Global Forum chairing a panel I was on, and as chair, he wasn't able to intervene on the subject we were discussing, but we had discussed the rise of protectionist tendencies in the world and our concern as Canadians for the protection of free trade. And I wonder, Mr. Smoot, if you would like to comment here today on where you see global trends moving and how you feel Canada can continue to push for open borders and free trade.
Well, thank you so much, Member Banda, and it's very nice to see you again. We are obviously, I think it probably goes without saying that we're strong advocates of free trade, of opening borders, of allowing businesses to move products, to reducing non-tariff barriers and so on. I think the opportunity is to join with like-minded organizations to work together. It's got to be all about collaboration. I was on a call today with the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce out of the UK, about green programming or trying to run with COP26. And I think the opportunity for us in Canada is to engage with like-minded folks. Our market is far too small for us to think that protectionism is going to support us in any way. It's we have to be open to outside markets, and for that we have to reduce protectionism here, and we have to advocate for it to be reduced elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses. It was very valuable information as we move forward into 2021. So wish you all luck. To the committee members, we have to leave this call and tap into another ID number and so on for the committee business. So if everybody could just leave and re-sign in with the other connection. Yes.
I just have a question, Madam Chair. Is there going to be a break, or do we need to connect right away?
Well, it's going to take I'm concerned it's going to take a few minutes. It's a different way than what we've done it before, and so I guess everybody could take a 2-minute break, but get signed in first so that we're all going to be there. All right? Thank you. See you all in a minute.
Thank